The Lost Soul Arts of Demon Souls is an argumentative video essay from 2017 made by longtime content creator and games critic MatthewMatosis. In this video, he makes his case that Demon Souls as the first game in what some would call the Soulsborne series contains its best elements, which have not been replicated since, and not only that, but according to Matthew, have only degraded with every subsequent entry. The video itself is relatively old, being released about 4 years ago as of the making of this video. The reason I say this is that, for all I know, it may not accurately represent Matthew's current opinions on the series, as he has not made another video discussing them. I want to bring this up now because there will be points in this video where I mention Sekiro and Elden Ring to see how well some of Matthew's claims have held up. I find that even today, there are still people going to his video's comment section in order to discuss their discontent with the direction in which the franchise is heading, which is why I believe this video is still relevant enough to merit a response. I have decided to tackle Matthew's video in chronological order because of how interconnected his points are. Anyone interested should definitely go and watch Matthew's video in full before listening to what I have to say about it. One brief aside, anytime I refer to Demon Souls, Dark Souls 1, 2 and 3 and Bloodborne as the series, I am doing so to refer to all these games in a shorthanded way, and I do not mean to imply that they are necessarily a series of cohesive sequels. I make this distinction now because Matthew regularly refers to these games as sequels to each other when that's not true. So, without further ado, let's get into the video.
Dark Souls. It's a game and a series that needs no introduction, so I haven't bothered to write one. Instead, I'm going to get straight to the point. As much as these games have been revered and discussed to death, it seems to me as though the actual origin of the series has all but been forgotten, and I don't just mean by the community. Many of the merits and ideals of Demon Souls have faded away in the following entries, starting even as early as the original Dark Souls.
This claim that the merits of Demon Souls have been fading away from the series is essentially the premise of Matthew's argument. I disagree with this premise for reasons I will elaborate on further as Matthew begins to argue in favor of it.
After Demon Souls was a surprise hit, Fromsoft set out to make it again, only this time bigger and better. In many ways, Dark Souls was an ambitious sequel. The world was much larger and interconnected, which added a whole new satisfaction to exploration. The inability to warp from one area to another forced players into lengthy journeys, giving the game a sense of isolated adventure that even Demon Souls couldn't offer. The animations were more polished, with even more of that satisfying weight that the series is known for.
Matthew is correct when he describes Dark Souls as an ambitious game. However, he calls Dark Souls a sequel. This is not the case. Dark Souls is not a sequel to Demon Souls. They are two separate games in the same genre made by the same developer. Does Dark Souls iterate on its predecessor? Sure. But it is reductive to say that it is just a bigger and better version of Demon Souls, when the similarities between the two games exist mainly on the foundational level, like the game engine, shared game mechanics, and their medieval setting. This is like saying that Telltale's The Wolf Among Us is a sequel to The Walking Dead. They share the same general framework, use the same engine and similar game mechanics, but they're not directly related to each other, and a player should adjust their expectations to account for that.
There were a bunch of refinements to the formula, like Estus, which removed potential downtime and helped balance out the challenge.
This is a relatively small point, but the Estus system is really only as balanced as Matthew is saying if the player is relying on it exclusively, or is not experienced enough at the game to know the ways in which they can break the Estus system in their favor by using the Rite of Kindling to give themselves 20 Estus at every bonfire, or grinding for humanities from the various enemies that drop them. It is actually similar to how the player in Demon Souls can grind for healing items in Boletaria.
It even had a few completely new mechanics of its own, like Covenants. I think it's a great sequel, and judging by its phenomenal success, it seems that many other people agree. There is one important caveat though. It's not innovative. Many of the notable features that people assign to Dark Souls originated in Demon Souls and were simply brought across because they worked last time. The goal of Dark Souls wasn't innovation, it was refinement. Fromsoft already had a formula that worked, and they set out to exploit that fact.
It bears repeating that Dark Souls is not a sequel to Demon Souls. It is important to internalize this fact because Matthew uses this in a way to criticize Dark Souls and its successors in a way that is unfair, judging them by how closely they emulate the experience of playing Demon Souls. Also, how is Dark Souls not innovative? In every dictionary I checked, an innovation was always defined as a new idea or method for doing something, which can accurately be applied to all of the new ideas and methods that Fromsoft introduced in Dark Souls 1. like the Estes system and the interconnected world design, so presenting a lack of innovation as a caveat to Dark Souls being a great follow-up is incorrect. It took certain foundational aspects of Demon Souls and made a plethora of additions to them in order to be its own game. It's like saying that Demon Souls is not innovative because it takes the idea of having a dangerous, hostile, and trap-filled world and having slow and committal combat from Kingsfield. You could say that many of the notable features of Demon Souls originated in Kingsfield and were only brought over because they worked last time. When framed like this, I'm sure it is much easier to see how dismissive this claim is, because it fails to recognize any of Demon Souls' original additions as innovations. Of course, in Matthew's video, he does not even mention what these notable features that Dark Souls copied are, so it is even more non-specific, because it leaves it up to the audience to come up with their own conclusions as to what these are in the first place. Also, I do not like how he says that Fromsoft simply copied Demon Souls, because Dark Souls is not just a Demon Souls impersonator. Matthew himself also just got done talking about the ways in which Dark Souls is its own game, by bringing up a laundry list of its own features. And even if Dark Souls was not innovative, which it is, that in and of itself is not a flaw. Criticizing something for not being innovative is not valid because assessing the quality of a work of art or piece of media should be based upon appraising how well or how poorly it does what it's trying to do, and not just how many new things it does.
This is what really sets Demon Souls apart from the rest of the series. Early in its development, the project was assumed by many in Fromsoft to already be a failure. Maybe a demoralizing way to think, but also liberating in a sense. That assumption is the main reason why director Hidetaka Miyazaki was able to take control of the project, and why he and his team were able to implement some, at the time, bizarre features. With Demon Souls, there was a sense that the developers were just doing whatever the hell they wanted, playing with conventions and trying new features out with little care about how appealing they would be to a mass audience. World Tendency is a perfect example of this. Some developers believe that dynamic difficulty tuning is the correct way to build their games, and even games in general. This method of design has been gaining traction since around the 90s, and given its success, it can be found in subtle forms in many mainstream games today. Other people, like myself, prefer when a game is consistently difficult, so there's a more genuine sense of satisfaction when you finally overcome the challenge at hand. Demon Souls turns its back on both of those ideas and cuts your health in half as soon as you die. As if that isn't enough, repeated deaths will increase enemy stats and eventually spawn additional Black Phantoms to make the stage even tougher. Now, you might think this is a poor mechanic. There are some very sound, logical arguments against it. I'm not saying that every game should work this way, but hopefully you can understand that I find this refreshing for the simple fact that it's different from everything else. This, for me at least, was the real appeal of Demon Souls. Time and again, they threw out the rulebook and just did whatever they felt like.
Matthew's enjoyment of Demon Souls because of how different it is from anything else he has played is valid. Unfortunately, he weaponizes this enjoyment later on by turning it into scorn for the rest of FromSoft's games by saying that they are like everything else. While I will tackle that point in a more in-depth way when he says it, being similar to other things is not a flaw. Something being unique is not an objective virtue. A video game can be as unique as the day is long, but still be bad. Demon Souls' development cycle certainly did have a large impact on the final product, but low expectations are not the only thing capable of fostering a liberating game development ecosystem. Despite growing acclaim and greater appeal to a larger audience, I see no reason to believe that FromSoft has ever strayed from the path of making the games that they want to make. It could be that what FromSoft wants to make usually coincides with what audiences find appealing. There are instances where FromSoft did not capitulate to audience demands. Ever since Dark Souls 1, there has been constant outcry for FromSoft to replicate its approach to world design. FromSoft has not done this, because it is either not something that they wish to do again, or because it would be hazardous to their development pipeline. They create what they want to make, as much as the process of game development, as chaotic as it is, allows them to.
Conventional wisdom says that struggling players should be offered a helping hand, not pushed down a well. Conventional wisdom says that a boss should be killed by the player, not themselves. Conventional wisdom says that secrets should be secret, not pointed out by someone else. Conventional wisdom says that important NPCs and vendors are off limits, not murdered while the player isn't looking. Conventional wisdom says that the final boss should be an epic showdown, a test of the player's skills, not a pathetic, harmless blob.
While I do not know of any games that came out before Demon Souls that actively increased the stats of enemies as a result of the player dying, that could possibly be because a game like that exists and I was just unable to find it. There have been plenty of games with a similar snowballing difficulty curve where failures of the player directly correlate to a more difficult experience. In grand strategy games, for instance, a player can find themselves at a serious disadvantage for not being able to keep up with their competitors. Many games back in the day had a lives counter system that would send the player back to the start of the game if they failed. Diablo had an early game common enemy that would drain your level if they hit you. While these are not exactly the same thing, they are still mechanics that greatly increase the difficulty if you fail at the game. In Fallout 1, the player had the option of convincing the final boss to kill himself, and I sincerely doubt that Demon's Souls was the first game that let players communicate with each other to the point that they were able to point out traps and secrets. It seems like any multiplayer RPG has the same capacity for rejecting traditional wisdom in that aspect. NPCs die all of the time without the player's direct involvement in Oblivion due to the Radiant AI in that game. In Shadow Tower, the final boss is also a former king who has been reduced to a pathetic and harmless blob, who dies in a few attacks. This boss battle could possibly be the direct inspiration for True King Allant, because Shadow Tower is a Fromsoft game, and it's perfectly plausible that Miyazaki or another member of the development team had played it, or at least acquired general information about it before or during the development of Demon's Souls. Now, I'm not bringing up these examples as a means of criticizing Demon's Souls or saying that it is a derivative of any of the games that I listed. This is to say that you should not put this game or any other game on a pedestal where it is praised as being wholly unique. Every game leans on an already established set of tropes to some degree. Matthew's excessive praise of this game in particular for being original is misguided because all of these things are present in other games and other bits of media because Demon's Souls is a product of different influences. His dismissal of the other games in the series for not being as original is also misguided because it too comes from the argument of originality.
It's the boss fights that stick out the most, with 4 of the 5 archdemons clearly being designed to provide a memorable experience above all else. Even False King Allant, the most traditional of the 5, has an incredibly punishing grab which actually de-levels the player character, something the series hasn't seen since. This kind of experimentation doesn't always work. There's not many people out there who'll defend the encounter with the Dragon God, but an occasional failure is to be expected if a game is stepping outside the norm so much.
I'm glad that Matthew finds these bosses memorable. I think they're memorable too. The problem is that whether or not something is memorable is completely subjective and says nothing about their quality. If this is an implicit way of arguing that the bosses in later games are less memorable, then that only really matters as much as you care about Matthew's opinion.
To me, an anticlimactic non-boss like Maiden Astraea has just as much value, if not more, than something more traditional like Flame Lurker. There are other games I can play if I want a Flame Lurker-esque experience, but only one game has Maiden Astraea.
Because it is not obvious what Matthew thinks a Flame Lurker-esque experience is, my best guess is that it is a one-on-one fight where the player needs to learn the boss's moveset in order to evade its attacks and counter with their own attacks until the boss is dead. This definition has no descriptive value whatsoever, because it is so broad that it encompasses nearly every single boss fight in any given action game. Be this as it may, Flame Lurker is an experience unique to Demon's Souls because it is a product of the mechanics of Demon's Souls. If you put the Flame Lurker in another game like Devil May Cry, God of War, or even Dark Souls 3, it is not going to be the same experience because those games are not Demon's Souls. This is an example of Matthew using very nebulous parameters in order to draw false equivalencies between these games and every other action game ever made, so he can then criticize them for not being original, and argue that if people want these things, they could just go and play a better action game. This tactic is incredibly fallacious because it requires the person positing the argument to ignore any and all nuance and oversimplify things. It is something I like to call missing the trees for the forest.
Later entries in the series, including the original Dark Souls, have largely done away with those weird boss fights, to the detriment of the overall experience. To understand why this is a bad thing, we have to confront a hard truth that few people seem to want to face about the Souls games, including Fromsoft themselves, but here it is. The combat is nothing remarkable. Before you get your codpiece in a twist, keep in mind that doesn't equate to mediocre gameplay. As a whole, it's hugely elevated by generally great level design, player freedom, loadout options, and some unique supplemental mechanics like World Tendency, Covenants, and Insight. The stamina system puts other action RPGs to shame, the animations are great, and the controls are tight, but in terms of actual complexity, there's not much going on.
This is the turning point of the video where Matthew reveals his true intentions. From this point onward, his method for criticizing FromSoft's games will be to say that their core mechanics are far below the standards of other action games, and the only thing that elevates them is when they do the unique things that Demon's Souls does, and then to argue that they do not even do that. Now, he did say that simple mechanics do not equate to mediocre gameplay, but this does not really align with how he speaks of the games later on. Instead, it seems more like when a critic proclaims to love a work and gives it surface level praise, just to attack it with lies and fallacies during their supposed critique. Starting with these initial claims, first and foremost, these games at no point stray away from weird boss fights. Later in the video, I will have a list consisting of all the bosses that have unique mechanics that set them apart from your usual dodge and attack affair. I also find it ironic that Matthew asserts that the combat is nothing remarkable, and then he goes on to list a few of the many things that FromSoft does in order to make it remarkable. He says that, in terms of actual complexity, there's not much going on. But these things that he listed, as well as the plethora of things that he did not list, are actually complex. You can't juggle hollows or string together combos, but there is no shortage of situations where the player is given the opportunity to benefit from playing the game in a complex way. Is using Report to get dangerous enemies to kill each other and then picking off the survivors not complex? Is casting Vow of Silence and Soul of Cinder whenever he starts casting spells not complex? To be fair, they only require the player to engage with the RPG mechanics, to make a build, customize their loadout, develop a strategy, and then execute it in a stressful situation, so who knows, maybe that's not complex enough for MatthewMatosis.
There's not much depth, and that wouldn't be a problem, except that the series has increasingly leaned on its action elements more and more as time has gone by. Bloodborne is the clearest example of this so far. The player character's starting stamina is generous, and it's easy to level up every useful stat for your build with no meaningful trade-offs whatsoever. At this point, stats mainly exist so struggling players can grind out an advantage and carry on, the kind of self-controlled dynamic difficulty the series excels at. To put it simply, Bloodborne is more action, less RPG.
No meaningful trade-offs. I had no idea I could have a Blood Tinge build, Arcane build, Strength build, and Skill build all at the same time. If I had known that I could have cruised through the entire game with a Madara's Whistle, a Cannon, a Call Beyond, and the Rakuyo all at the same time and get anything better than mediocre damage without having to grind to an absurd blood level far beyond what the average player is by the end of the game, then I would have had a much easier time with it. Also, he deliberately selects Bloodborne as his example of how the RPG mechanics of these games have deteriorated in favor of basic action. The game with the smallest scope of the series at the time, with the smallest selection of weapons, armors, builds, and by extension playstyles, when Dark Souls 1, 2, and 3 exist and have an even larger diversity of playstyles that are determined by the player allocating soul levels. What Matthew is doing is not just demeaning Bloodborne, but demeaning this mechanic in the entire series. Even so, I can't help but feel I'm selling Bloodborne short by saying it has the smallest scope. A player using a skill build will find themselves with a completely different set of advantages and disadvantages from a player using an arcane build, as well as a different path for optimal game progression where the player can collect the items most useful for their build as soon as possible. Every single build in the game is like this, and this isn't even mentioning blood gems and whether your weapon is a regular, uncanny, or lost version. There are spreadsheets for what chalice dungeon to go if you want specific items for your build, as well as build calculators. I do not know how anyone can see this and say that there is not much depth. Perhaps if Matthew did not know that Bloodborne had this kind of depth, then he was not really ready to make a video that was critical of it. In order to belabor this point to a painful degree, I would like to talk about two of my recent playthroughs of Dark Souls 3. One as a Dex Mage, and the other one as a Strength Faith tank build. As a Dex Mage who put most of his points into Dex, Intelligence, Vigor, and Attunement, I was left with very few points for Strength and Vitality, which limited me to Dex weapons and light armor. I chose to attune spells that were oriented more towards subterfuge and stealth, like Hidden Body, Spook, and Rapport, in order to slink through levels without having to put myself in too much danger. The options this build gave me started out as a series of fun novelties, but as I gained a better understanding of my character's strengths, they became more and more integrated into my playstyle. I would always stealth through tricky enemy encounters, get critical attacks with my dagger, use Rapport whenever being attacked by multiple enemies, and use Alluring Skulls whenever they were useful. During boss fights, I was stuck using mid-shields, so I needed to cast Great Magic Shield in order to make them viable. This playthrough gave me some of the most gratifying moments I've had with this game for a long time, my favourite of which being my boss fight with the Deacons of the Deep. After initiating the second phase of the battle, I used alluring skulls to separate the fodder enemies from the Archdeacon, placed a magic buff on my dagger, and caught the boss in a loop of throwing skulls and backstabbing the Archdeacon until he was dead. I fully expected the Strength Faith tank build to fail because I have seen people describe Dark Souls 3 as being a rolling simulator. Imagine though my surprise when not only was I able to either block or tank most enemy encounters and bosses in the game, I actually had a pretty easy time with several bosses, because I didn't have to worry about learning their attack patterns. I would just put up my big shield, or tank their damage with the defense and poise given to me by Perseverance, while regaining HP thanks to my regen miracles and my blessed cestus. I actually found myself having a great time managing when to fat roll through an enemy's attacks to conserve health and when to just tank and punish their attacks. Since I was working with a faith build as well, I could equip Vow of Silence in order to completely cripple several bosses in the game. Deacons of the Deep and Aldridge being some of my favourites because of how completely defenseless they were after I cast the spell. Having the Executioner's Greatsword as a sheathed secondary arm was also extremely helpful since every enemy I disposed of granted me more FP, which I could then use to continue the cycle of using Perseverance to melt them into dust. I mean, who really needs rolling when you have Perseverance, fat armor, and a big shield? These are two examples of how stat allocation plays a large role in determining how you play from one game in this franchise, the game that I thought of as being a rolling simulator before doing this run. Bloodborne has a similar amount of depth, but to a smaller degree though. What is actually lacking in depth is Matthew's perspective, not these games.
Unfortunately, even with the addition of trick weapons, there's still a case to be made that overall the combat doesn't even have depth exceeding basic action games. If you're a staunch defender of the series, this is where you might be tempted to rattle off all the different attack animations your favourite weapon has. After all, there's two-handed attacks, jumping attacks, running attacks, charged attacks, transformation attacks, and probably more. It's true that there are differences in range and damage, but the effect on the enemy is usually identical. They lose some health, possibly suffer some hit stun, which either lasts long enough to get another attack in, or it doesn't, in which case you go back on the defensive until your next opening. Positioning is important, but that's about the extent of it.
I find it funny that Matthew showed off all of these different attack animations and was only able to pick up on the differences between range and damage. Even a perspective as uncharitable as Matthew's should still be able to pick up on the differences in timing between these attacks. If you're not being as uncharitable, then things get a little bit more complicated. Aside from range, damage, and timing, there is hyper armor, damage type, stamina consumption, whether the attack is a thrust, horizontal, or vertical slash, whether or not it can be parried, whether or not it bounces off of enemy shields or walls, its stagger potential, and if the weapon itself does extra critical damage, and also whether it inflicts a status effect like poison, bleed, or frostbite. This means that even if every enemy in the game has the same reaction to being hit with every weapon, which they don't, it would only matter so much, because the use of the weapon itself and the incorporation of all of these factors is what determines the playstyle of the person holding the controller. It's not about raw controller inputs, it's about the intersection between situational awareness, decision-making, and input complexity. Once again, Matthew has conflated his simplistic view of the combat with a lack of complexity on the game's part.
If anything, Bloodborne actually has less depth than any other game in the series because shields are disincentivized and unable to parry, making the two things mutually exclusive when players used to be able to do both without having to swap between them. The magic implementation is also quite bare bones, and it even lacks a kick option, although that would be irrelevant anyway since so few enemies have a defensive stance.
If anything, Bloodborne's take on the concept is more complex because the player is expected to switch between a gun and a shield. The gun is also a multifunctional tool which has a variety of different uses depending on the scenario. For example, the gun can parry, but it can also be your primary ranged attack, or even your primary damage dealer with a blood-tinged build. The purpose of the lock shield is not to block physical damage, but instead to block non-physical damage, which can actually be a literal game changer when fighting something like Mikolash, and it can still be very useful in a myriad of other encounters. Let's not forget, this change was not made without bringing anything to the table. Bloodborne does things this way because it has trick weapons, where the player can change the form of their weapon on the fly. That is why the lock shield is only capable of blocking. Also, Shields play a smaller role in Bloodborne because they did not want players going through the entire game blocking everything. This game tries to incentivize fast-paced, aggressive combat behavior from their players, and it makes the changes to the Souls game's mechanics in order to better suit that goal. As stated earlier though, Bloodborne is a smaller game with a smaller scope than the Dark Souls games, and yet Hunter tools, the equivalent of magic in this game, are fleshed out enough to focus an entire build around them. If even that's bare bones for a tool that is usually complementary to melee combat, then I would like to see a magic system that achieves a suitable level of depth for Matthew, so I can understand what a non-bare bones system even is. At this point, the problem seems to be with Matthew's expectations rather than the execution of the mechanic. A kick would also serve no purpose in Bloodborne, as Matthew states himself, so why weep for its departure? Keeping the kick would do nothing other than needlessly clutter the control scheme of a game where precision is key during combat.
At the end of the day, your options generally boil down to a low-cost light attack, a high-cost heavy attack, and a ranged option of some sort, be it a spell, an item, a bow, or a gun.
Once again, Matthew has made a generalization that has no value because it encompasses most action-oriented games to ever exist. I could say this about any of the God of War or Ninja Gaiden games and it would still be accurate, even though their combat is nothing like the combat in Dark Souls. Of course, those games usually have multiple weapons with multiple variations of light, heavy, and ranged attacks, but so does Dark Souls. Despite the broadness of this statement, it still does not cover even the most basic combat mechanics in these games, like parries, ripostes, and combos. This argument of the player's attack options being overly homogenized loses even more relevance when you factor in magic and ranged attacks, and items like the pistol, cannon, Augur of Ebrietas, Madara's Whistle, A Call Beyond, Black Sky Eye, Flamethrower, Molotov, Poison Knife, Shaman Boneblade, Simon's Bowblade, and the Blunderbuss. All of these options have different effects, different strengths, different drawbacks, and many of them have variants that make more minor changes. His argument loses all reason not to be discarded when you factor in Dark Souls 2 and 3, which have an even richer variety of magic and ranged attacks.
Apart from destroying the grounded aesthetic these games are or were known for, the weapon arts of Dark Souls 3 are kind of a step in the right direction, but the synergy between all these things is practically non-existent. For example, there's few spells that allow you to set up an enemy for an interesting melee attack and vice versa.
I had no clue that these games were known for their grounded aesthetic. I can't wait to read whatever study Matthew based that claim on. But first I would need a definition of what a grounded aesthetic is to Matthew so I can know how they were destroyed by implementing weapon arts. How is a knight performing an upward slash with a longsword any less grounded than the Moonlight Greatsword's ranged attacks, or using the severed tail of an enemy as a weapon in Dark Souls? How is it any less grounded than the Storm Ruler in Demon Souls? How is any of this less grounded than a spell like Firestorm or a weapon like the Dragon Bone Smasher? I'm sure Matthew could probably muster up a defense for this statement, but since he makes no effort to qualify it by defining what he means by grounded, the only thing I can do is ask basic questions and point out the absurdity of this argument. Also, weapon arts act as a great example actually of how Fromsoft is constantly building and iterating upon their combat systems. An equivalent example from other games would be Dark Souls 2 adding power stancing, which later became paired weapons in Dark Souls 3, and the rally system in Bloodborne. And I can only wonder what an interesting melee attack is to a person who does not like weapon arts for destroying the grounded aesthetics and is willing to boil the melee combat down to just being a bunch of light and heavy attacks. Unfortunately, we will never know because Matthew will never define what he means by interesting melee attack. Does using force to knock an enemy down and catch them in a loop of heavy attacks count? Does using Oral Decoy, Rapport, Dead Again, Hidden Body, or any of the myriad other stealth-related spells to ambush an enemy count? Does using Augur of Ebrietas to set up an enemy for a visceral attack count? Does using Perseverance to poise through enemy attacks so you can melt them with your own attacks count? How about using your weapon art to guard break an enemy like Matthew did in his own footage? I would list more ways to synergize spells and weapon arts into your playstyle, but these options are so thoroughly weaved into the game design to the point where I would end up listing nearly every spell, weapon art, and attack in the game. Perhaps these options are interesting enough, but are simply too few. From these examples I mentioned, and the one Matthew himself showed, we can already determine that his assertion that synergy between these things is non-existent is false. Even so, I believe the way Matthew is looking at it may not be the best. Rather than looking for direct combo synergies between your different offensive options, I believe you should look at all of them as tools to tackle a variety of situations the game presents you. Different long-range options, such as spells, arrows, and guns, and even items, have different properties to each other, like tracking, speed, damage output, and resource consumption. But they serve the purpose of damaging enemies you can't reach with your standard melee weapon. Likewise, a spell like Rapport allows you to assist your melee combat by enlisting an enemy as a diversion, or potentially an even better damage dealer than your regular weapon. If you look at all these tools in a macro scale rather than a micro scale, you can find several different ways to create synergies between your tools depending on your own playstyle.
In terms of defensive options, the series is a lot better, with the ability to block, parry, or dodge most regular attacks. These go a long way during regular combat encounters, but unfortunately against bosses, parrying is often completely impossible and blocking is often ill-advised, which leaves you with rolling as your one and only defensive action. So prepare to roll, again and again, and again and again and again.
Parrying bosses usually being impossible is true for Demon's Souls and Dark Souls 1, as the vast majority of bosses cannot be parried to any capacity with the exception of Gald Vinland, Old Monk, and Gwyn. And even then, the only bosses you can parry in Demon's Souls are NPCs. The rest of Fromsoft's catalogue, on the other hand, utilizes the feature far more in its boss fights. In Dark Souls 2, you can parry the Pursuer, Dragon Rider, Old Dragon Slayer, Ruined Sentinels, Belfry Gargoyles, Lost Sinner, Skeleton Lords, Mytha, the Baneful Queen, Twin Dragon Riders simultaneously, Velstad, Grave Robber Vargan Co., and the Throne Watcher and Defender. In Bloodborne, you can parry Father Gascoigne, Blood-Starved Beast, Gammon, Mikolash, Lady Maria, Martyr Ligarius, Orphan of Kos, Shadows of Yharnam, Living Failures, Merciless Watchers, Beast-Possessed Soul, Keeper of the Old Lords, Thumerian Descendant, Thumerian Elder, and Queen Yharnam, and probably some others that I couldn't even find. In Dark Souls 3 you can parry Iudex Gundia, Crystal Sage, Deacons of the Deep, Abyss Watchers, Pontiff Sullivan, Champion Gundia, Lorien the Elder Prince, Sister Frieda, Half-Light, and the Grave Tender. Matthew also comments on blocking, saying it is often ill-advised during boss fights. For Dark Souls 2, and Dark Souls 3, this statement is blatantly untrue. I have no idea whether it is true in Demon's Souls, because I did not try blocking boss attacks in that game, so I won't speak on it. But this statement from Matthew is a falsehood so blatant that I am shocked and disappointed that it slipped past those who have watched this video. My disappointment goes double for Matthew, as he should know better than to say something like this, for it can only be one or two things. It is either a bold-faced lie Matthew told in order to harm the reputation of these games with no regard for honesty or accuracy, or it was born from such a high level of ignorance of these games and their mechanics that Matthew had no business talking about them in the first place. Of course, it could also just be both at the same time. I went through Dark Souls 1 using the Dragon Crest shield, which can be found mere minutes after exiting the Undead Asylum if you have the Master Key, and before the Bell Gargoyles without it. And it was more than enough to protect me from the attacks of early game bosses like Capra Demon, as well as late game bosses like the Sanctuary Guardian and Artorias. Using Great Magic Shield made it so I could reliably block Gwyn's damage output. Using a Great Shield made the Four Kings a joke, and using Great Magic Shield on a Great Shield made it so I could easily block Calamete's sweeping fire attacks. I think it is safe to say that blocking is a valid avenue of damage avoidance in Dark Souls 1. In Dark Souls 3, I did some sequence breaking to grind for the Cathedral Knight Great Shield early, which is one of the few shields I used to block damage throughout the entire game. Consequently, I spent the vast majority of the game over 70% encumbrance. From the very beginning I was able to block the damage of Champion Gundia with a mid-shield at level 30, and I ended up being able to handily defeat bosses like Medivh and the Demon Prince by blocking and tanking their damage, and maybe fat rolling through one or two attacks. Shields across the entire franchise also serve the purpose of resisting the buildup of status ailments, like Bleed, Toxic, and Poison, and can be used strategically in this way as well. For example, in Blighttown, I used my shield to slowly build up Toxic, and then I topped my bar off with Dung Pies in order to give myself the weakened form of it. As stated earlier, tanking is also an option if you tailor your build to it. Anyone who has properly explored their options could tell you that blocking, outspacing, and poising through enemy attacks are all viable. So despite what Matthew may tell you, you can prepare not to dodge. Again and again, and again 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 and
When you're not rolling, you'll generally be getting 1 to 2 hits in with whatever weapon you choose. Hits that usually provoke no response from the boss whatsoever, making every weapon basically the same thing apart from whatever damage types and numbers it has.
You could roll and punish through every single boss fight Fromsoft has made since 2009 and onwards, but as I have proven, it is far from your only option. Fortunately, most of the bosses in these games are easy to stagger with the right weapon type. For example, I was able to stagger Gale several times by using the Cestus, and hitting him several times in quick succession. And I was able to do the same to Pontiff Sullivan, but this time with around 2 well-placed charged R2s from an Ultra Greatsword. As a side note, he is saying this over a fight with a Pursuer, who is an easily parryable boss.
That's not to say that bosses like this can't be good. They can be. At their worst, they're camera-eating monstrosities with infinite stamina that blatantly read your inputs, cancel their recovery animations and have nonsensical tracking, but at their best, they're fair, challenging and have great presentation.
Usually, whenever a boss is eating your camera, it is because you are backed into a corner and locked on. Or you are too close to a boss that is too big and are locked on, and the camera will try to angle itself up and get closer to your character, inhibiting your visibility. Lock-on is simply a tool at the player's disposal which can be used correctly and incorrectly, and is not obligatory. You do not have to utilize it during every single moment of every single encounter, so the remedy for this situation is simply to lock off and try to escape whatever corner the boss is trapping you in, so you can attack them from a more advantageous angle. In Sekiro, your FOV is increased during certain boss fights. This also happens in Dark Souls 3, and this is to further cut down on these types of situations. On the subject of animation cancelling and input reading, these are positive claims, and without a shred of evidence to back them up, I see no reason to believe them, especially because I, in my years of playing these games, have never experienced this. The bosses in these games have exactly as much tracking as their respective game requires them to, and even if bosses seem relentless with their attacks, they always have openings for the player to capitalize on, be it by healing, backing away, or counterattacking.
False King Alant is a great boss, so are Artorias, Ludwig and Sister Fried among many others FromSoft have put together over the years, but they're also undeniably samey. You go in, you learn the moveset, maybe you die a few times along the way until you know the boss's moves like the back of your hand, then you dodge past them, punish at the right times and win the battle. It's perfectly serviceable gameplay, but doing it 20 times in one game is just excessive.
So, many of the bosses in this series are samey because they require you to learn their attack patterns and how to defeat them by using core game mechanics like dodging and attacking, and doing it 20 times in one game is excessive. Does Matthew think that rhythm games are excessive because their entire gameplay loop is learning the rhythm of a song and pressing the correct sequence of buttons at the correct times? If that is so, then the problem is with Matthew and not the games themselves, because this gameplay loop is their entire appeal, and someone who does not like rhythm games is clearly not the intended audience for your average rhythm game. Of course, all of this is based upon taking for granted that Matthew's oversimplification of the process of defeating a boss is accurate, which it is not. Mastering a boss's attack patterns is not necessary, because the game gives you a bevy of options that allow players to tackle things in other ways, like using a shield, co-oping with a player or an NPC, and keeping your distance from a boss and using ranged attacks. These are all ways of defeating a boss without having to attain a master-level grasp on their attack patterns. This is something that anybody who has played these games more than once using different builds would know innately, because they would have done it themselves. Even this is dependent on the assumption that all of the bosses are samey, but if your definition of samey is needing to understand how the boss fights and being able to fight back, then how does this not apply to every single boss fight in gaming? This is another example of MatthewMatosis furthering his argument using a generalization so broad that it has zero argumentative value. Also, these games aren't boss rushes. The bosses are highlights after what could be several hours of exploration, where players can utilize other gameplay elements to their leisure. How can boss fights be excessive when they account for a relatively small percentage of the actual playtime? These games are properly paced. I hope this goes to show just how many erroneous assumptions you have to grant in order for Matthew's argument to have even the tiniest, most emaciated leg to stand on.
This has been the go-to boss design philosophy for FromSoft ever since Artorias of the Abyss, and fights have only gotten more shonen anime over time. To be clear, there's absolutely nothing wrong with simple combat mechanics. I'm not saying you should be able to juggle hollows or anything, but if the game is going to be so relentlessly focused on action, then I have fewer reasons not to just play a better action game instead. What I can't get elsewhere are the memorable experiences that Demon's Souls presented by taking risks. The archdemons are the clearest example of that, but even its more traditional boss fights serve a greater purpose.
Shonen anime. As in, anime made specifically for young or teenage boys? Shonen anime like Naruto, One Piece, Soul Eater, and Dragon Ball Z? I fail to see even the slightest similarity between any shonen anime and even a single boss from the entire Fromsoft catalog, and I fail to see the relevance of this statement in the first place. Are the bosses like shonen anime because they're flashy and action-packed? Berserk, a manga series that Dark Souls was heavily inspired by, has its fair share of bombastic, superhuman battles, but I don't think anyone would describe that as a series for young boys. Can't a flashy and action-focused boss also convey deep themes at the same time, though? Also, the assertion that this is FromSoft's go-to format for boss design is incorrect, because there are plenty of bosses that are not made with this philosophy in mind. Bosses that put strategy and the exploitation of a specific weakness above mechanical mastery, like the Deacons of the Deep or the Curse-Rotted Greatwood. And there are plenty of bosses that are subtle and not apocalyptic fights to the death with a godlike opponent, like the Royal Rat Vanguard or the Crystal Sage. I do agree that there's nothing wrong with simplistic combat, but the combat in Dark Souls, Bloodborne, and Demon's Souls cannot accurately be described as simplistic to begin with because of all the things that elevate it beyond it being just a dodge and attack simulator that we discussed earlier. Additionally, because of the escalation in action, FromSoft has made sure to escalate the amount of action and RPG-related resources for the player. Bloodborne is debatably a caveat because it is smaller in scope, but it still does the same things. Memorable experiences, though, can be found in anything that a person is capable of remembering. You cannot just conflate your opinions with fact and present it as an argument. I could say that Lady Maria and Slave Knight Gale are more memorable than anything in Demon's Souls, and it would still mean absolutely nothing if you don't care about my opinion. Except I didn't spend 9 minutes trying to rob the bosses of the other games of their uniqueness in order to convey it.
Demon's Souls' greatest strength is how it pulls you into its bleak, dangerous world so that you think about situations the way you would if you were actually there. This is something that the Souls games continue to do kind of well, but Demon's Souls still does it the best of them all because, excluding the innovative online features, almost everything else works in service of that larger goal.
The ability to suck a player into the world and put them in the same headspace as the character they're controlling is definitely a boon in the game's favour. But this is hardly unique to Demon's Souls itself, because Dark Souls and Bloodborne are rich with scenarios that achieve the same effect. Replaying the games for this video, I was thrown into hurdle after hurdle where I needed to change my armor, rings, attune spells, and tactics in order to overcome a challenge. Using alluring skulls to make the armored boar burn itself alive made me feel like an adventurer. Using rapport to instigate fights between powerful enemies in Lothric Castle made me feel like an adventurer. Using spook to survive a large fall made me feel like an adventurer. Following and assisting a cheerful Onion Knight on his quest and being repaid with assistance during a boss fight made me feel like an adventurer. This is something the Souls games do well. There is no qualification needed. If anything, because of the larger pool of abilities the player has access to in subsequent games, it is debatable as to whether or not they're actually better at capturing this feeling of being in the shoes of the player character.
Phalanx, Leechmonger, Tower Knight, Fool's Idol, Old Hero, Maneaters, and Armor Spider all have quirks to their design or their arena that the player can exploit if they figure out. You don't outright win by doing so, but you gain a big advantage if you're willing to use your brain. It's a deceptively simple concept. Thinking about how to survive a boss by using clever tactics is exactly what a real adventurer would do. In a sense, the battle happens just as much outside the fog door as inside. Because of that, the mindset of the character and the player align in such a way that it pulls the player further into the experience. On the other hand, dodging telegraphed attacks which come out in predefined combos is just exploiting your knowledge that the AI is acting within the constraints of a computer game. This has the opposite effect. It widens the gap between the character and the player.
I do agree that designing bosses in a way that encourages the player to use their wit and outfox their opponent can be a great way to pull the player into the shoes of their character. Where I'm left confused is with Matthew's preceding statements though. Firstly, he calls learning a boss's moveset exploitation of the fact that your opponent is an AI. How is reacting to and eventually learning incoming attacks a form of exploitation? Most bosses in this series have a large enough pool of attacks that attaining a Zen-like complete understanding of them is incredibly difficult. For most bosses, I find myself reacting dynamically to their flurry of attacks, even if I do have a general understanding of the boss's AI and moveset. I would think that the average player would have a similar experience where they defeat a boss before knowing it like the back of their hands. There are also bosses that have the ability to cancel their combos and resume them depending on the context, which gives them an even larger ability to mix up the player and make the fight more dynamic. Second, how does reacting to incoming attacks and figuring the best time to heal and attack further the gap between the player and the character? I would think the perspectives of the player and the character would align fairly closely during battles like these. Just as much as the more wit-based battles at least. Because of the intensity of many of these action-focused boss battles and their steep difficulty, the player will be forced to put more effort into their attempts and focus more of their attention on the boss, increasing immersion. A player could also be, for lack of a better word, role-playing as a skilled warrior who is able to perfectly dodge and punish every single boss, in which case they would likely feel very immersed when playing this way. Matthew's experience is not the standard for all experiences in these games, and people will find themselves drawn into the game's world for a variety of different reasons. Matthew has once again stated his opinion as though it were fact. Of course, this is granting him the point that these boss fights can be simplistically described as dodging and attacking simulators. Matthew has yet to back up this claim, and for reasons that I'm about to demonstrate, I do not believe this to be the case. These quirky bosses are present for every single one of Fromsoft's releases post-Demon Souls. Some games have more than others, sure, but writing them off as not having this thing that they very clearly do have is doing them a disservice. Because MatthewMatosis does not actively define what he finds to be quirky, I have extrapolated what he meant to the best of my abilities by looking at the bosses that he mentions positively, and what makes them quirky. The bosses listed are Phalanx, Tower Knight, Leechmonger, Maiden Astraea, Fool's Idol, Old Hero, False King Alant, Man-Eaters, True King Alant, Armor Spider, Gwyn, Sif, and Mikolash. From what I understand, a quirky boss can be one that subverts expectations, employs subversive tactics like running away or gaining assistance from another enemy, as well as dealing damage without directly attacking the player, among other things. Has level design within the boss arena that can be exploited by either the player or the boss himself. Has a weakness or weak spot that can be directly exploited by the player, or has a way in which the player can prepare for the boss fight before entering the arena. So, this is my list of all the bosses in these games that meet one or more of these requirements. Using this set of criteria, it is clear that Fromsoft has not lost their touch with boss design. That is not to say that they're all masterpieces of game design. As a matter of fact, some of the bosses on this list have glaring design flaws like the Bed of Chaos that is admittedly unfinished. I'm also not trying to say that Matthew should love these bosses because they have these quirks, because for one reason or another, it seems that many of them do not fit his personal preferences. They do, however, fit the requirements for having quirks, which I have extrapolated by looking at the things he praised about the bosses that he did like.
Most elements of Demon Souls can be viewed through this same lens. The environments are filled with difficult encounters, traps and ambushes, not just for their own sake, but to encourage a slow, methodical approach to exploration. This contrasts with the blasé way most protagonists throw themselves into dangerous situations. In reality, people tend to act more cautiously when they have a chance of being brutally murdered, so those punishing mechanics encourage you to think and behave that way. Perpetually autosaving over a single save file reinforces this as well. Even a trivial choice can feel like it has serious consequences because it's irreversible, just like real life. Of course, these elements work better the more unknowns you go up against. In other words, the element of surprise is pretty important. Venturing into Demon's Souls felt like venturing into the unknown, not because it was narratively unpredictable, but because it was mechanically unpredictable. Even once you got used to the Souls series features, which were brand new at the time, it still made sure to throw curveballs at you on a regular basis. Lack of careful observation was punished, NPCs weren't always what they appeared to be, bosses often had unique mechanics, and even the environments could be polar opposites of each other. Try one archstone and you'll end up in the claustrophobic halls of Latria. Try the other and you're headed towards a sprawling poison swamp.
Matthew has just stated some of Demon's Souls' positive attributes as a setup for his argument that Demon's Souls does all of these things better. When he starts making positive claims about the quality of the other games in the series, I can provide more detailed responses, but for now, he has just listed off a bunch of things that all of these games do, but framed in a Demon's Souls-centric way.
Incidentally, while you're spending so much time scanning the scenery for suspicious areas, you can't help but realise that the environments are actually built a lot like real places, much more so than any other game in this series. Shortcuts aren't just inexplicably one-sided gates or needlessly complex elevators, they're blockades to keep intruders out or mechanisms for transporting materials. This is half the point of shortcuts in the first place. They're a way of presenting checkpoints without making the world seem like it was built just for your convenience.
While I was initially very skeptical of Matthew's claim about inexplicably one-sided gates in the later games, I was surprised to find out that it actually had some merit to it. In Dark Souls 1, there are doors like the one leading to the lower burg that have a locking mechanism on the other side keeping you from entering until you explore the level further. Because of the design of these doors, there is no reason why your character should not be able to open the door from the side opposite the locking mechanism by slipping their hands through the bars and unlocking it. The design was changed in some doors in Dark Souls 3 to rectify this contrivance. However, there are instances of the locking mechanism being on the wrong side of the door, like the door leading to the elevator in High Wall of Lothric, which means that even though they changed the design, sometimes the doors are still inexplicably locked. There's also the gate in the Corvian settlement in Ashes of Ariandel, which has a nonsensical design with a locking mechanism on both sides. So I will concede that there are plenty of inexplicably one-sided gates in Dark Souls 1 and 3. That being said, I wish that Matthew had brought up an example or two of what he was talking about. It would have worked to bolster his point and saved anybody who wished to test the veracity of his claims a little bit of trouble. All of that being said, there are plenty of examples of doors having a sensible design that serves the completely rational purpose of keeping people on the outside from getting in, like the doors in Cathedral of the Deep. So it's not like Fromsoft lost all concept of how doors are supposed to work post Demon's Souls. As it stands, this is definitely something that Demon's Souls had a better grip on because there are no examples of a locked door not making sense in that game to my knowledge. His claim about needlessly complex elevators also has some truth to it, because there are elevators that, for whatever reason, cannot be summoned using a lever until the player activates the elevator. I cannot think of any rational explanations for this being the case. However, if we're talking about the purpose or the placement of elevators in the game world in later games, they serve the purpose of letting people get from one floor to another. It is built for convenience, but it is the convenience of the inhabitants just as much as it is for the players. That makes as much sense as using an elevator to transport ores. In this way, they are not needlessly complicated. There are also more creative shortcuts, like being able to access the boss near the beginning of Latria 2 after you destroy the heart, and using the bridge after deactivating the arrow trap mechanism in Latria 1. Later games have their own neat, well-contextualized shortcuts like using bombs to open a hole in the wall, kicking down withering trees to use as bridges, and using a ballista to open a hole to the demon ruins. But it is expected that subsequent games would bring something of their own to the table. I do not think Matthew's point about levels being more believable in Demon's Souls than they are in the later games has much value though, as the first level of Boletaria has an opening that the player can just casually walk through in order to enter the castle wall. This makes no logical sense, because they are very clearly trying to keep people out with the locked gates. But then there's just a random opening that people can walk through. There's not even any evidence that there was ever a gate there to begin with, and there is no lever to be seen. There's also the issue of why the elevators in Stonefang would be turned off in the first place, as it seems to be the site of an active mining operation, with enemies picking away at the wall and bagging ore, stoked flames everywhere, and fat officials making sure that everyone is hard at work. You would think that the elevator for transporting ore would already be active if there's evidence to suggest that people are still transporting ore. Ed is even hard at work forging weapons in a room filled with ore, so there's no reason to believe that he has been purposefully abandoned by the forces of Stonefang. To continue picking on Stonefang, the mine delves deep into the molten base of the mountain, and yet the entrance of the mine seems like it's just beginning to be mined out, with enemies still being able to fill bags with ore at the entrance to the mine. Even though these are some strange anomalies in the presentation of Demon Souls, I am not saying this to bash the game or say that Dark Souls does it better. All of the areas in these games, with the odd exception here and there, are able to portray a sensible enough environment for the fantasy setting that they inhabit, and are only held back by the occasional hiccup, like a flaw in the architecture or a door that doesn't make sense. It does not seem like any of these games can be singled out as the best one in this regard, as they're all on a similar level of quality.
After picking up on those environmental details, you might go on to notice that the enemy design and item placements have also been carefully considered to suit the area in question. What might not even occur to you is how sparse the cutscenes are, keeping interruptions to a minimum, or that the sound design could be described as minimalist as well. Most of what you hear as you wander through the stages is completely diegetic. Even death and resurrection are contextualized by the Nexus, weakening the barrier between the player and the game. By this point, the biggest thing standing between you and Boletaria are the loading screens. The word I've been avoiding is immersion, but hopefully now that I've explained it, you can see that's what it is. Demon Souls' greatest strength is its immersive quality. That alone would be enough to make it a pretty good game, but what puts it over the top is the way it capitalizes on that immersion by throwing the player into a variety of situations which they can now experience as a first-hand participant. Patch's trickery, the imposing mind flayers, Yurt's betrayal, among many others. All these things hit harder because the game does so much work establishing itself beforehand. The rest of the series has thoughtlessly replicated many ideas from Demon Souls, which often defeats the purpose and occasionally completely misses the point.
I agree that this cacophony of design choices made by Fromsoft do work in service of providing a very immersive experience, but I have no idea how any of the subsequent games could possibly be lacking in this department, seeing as how they follow similar guidelines. Surprisingly, Matthew will elaborate on this point about Fromsoft thoughtlessly replicating their own ideas, which is good, but it is also an exceedingly cynical and demeaning thing to say. It makes it seem like any dark fantasy RPG that Fromsoft makes will never be its own thing in Matthew's eyes, and will always be just another replication of Demon Souls.
The first time you have to make your way through a poison swamp, it's a new and interesting challenge. It gets your guard up, you have to think about your situation and make sure you have suitable equipment on hand. After 5 games in a row, it's become a predictable, tiresome routine. Even though it's the exact same thing mechanically, it now pulls you out of the game rather than in.
There's no reason for it not to get your guard up every time. They're all swamps that are full of dangerous enemies and poison slowly eating away at your health, and you're expected to sufficiently prepare yourself every single time, or else the games will just block your progress by killing you. Predictability is not inherently a flaw. Some people are actually capable of gaining satisfaction from accurately predicting things. You being made unhappy by it does not reflect poorly on the games themselves. There are also people who enjoy seeing how games iterate on concepts of previous games. For example, these games did not just create Valley of Defilement 5 times in a row. There's only one Valley of Defilement, and it's in Demon Souls. While Blighttown is similar in concept to Valley of Defilement, being a makeshift slum suspended above a swamp, it has enough of its own additions to the formula like toxic, new enemies, new level design, and new paths to traverse that it stands out. It is also balanced as an early game area, whereas Valley of Defilement requires the max HP, damage output, and availability of items usually associated with mid to late game characters. Dark Souls 2 has poison areas but no swamps. Harvest Valley has pockets of poison, and vases full of poison which the player can use to poison the enemies and boss of the area. Earthen Peak has poison in it, but the level design is vertically oriented, with the player navigating their way up a windmill. In Bloodborne, the swamp portion of the Nightmare Frontier makes up half of an optional area, and even then most of it can be ignored. The Nightmare Frontier is not even a swamp level, it's a nightmare level with a poison swamp in it. Dark Souls 3's Farron Keep is a very large swamp, but it looks nothing like the Valley of Defilement or Blighttown, and the player is given the very specific objective of visiting 3 towers which are more or less hidden from ground level, but can be seen easily from the bridge with the Stray Demon. Players who are having difficulty with the area can use this vantage point, internalize the direction in which they must go once they are back in the swamp, and complete the area this way. Outside of poisoning the player, they are not mechanically the same thing. They aren't even designed the same way in any of the games. I believe that calling this style of level tiresome is a jaded perspective. Not everybody has played every single From Software game. Not everybody is rattled by seeing similar concepts being used between games. Some people are even able to pick out the differences that distinguish one poison level from the other. I'm not sure why Matthew said that this is something that pulls you out of the experience, because I don't recall having my immersion waver at the sight of a swamp in a video game before. So I'm sure he means that it's something that pulls him out of the experience. After hearing all of the ways in which Matthew jadedly boils down this series of games in order to tear them down, I can't help but think that he may be numbly going through them, looking for ways to pull himself out of the experience. That's not to say that this is exactly what is happening. I would believe Matthew if he explained that this is not the case, but the things I've heard him say over the course of this video lead me to believe that he has a very low opinion of these games, seeing them just as a set of Demon Souls derivatives that will always fall short of the original. On one final note about this point though, I find it very telling that Matthew would use this as an example of how From Software mindlessly copies things that Demon Souls did first in the subsequent games, as if they are as jaded making these games as he is playing them. In a recent interview with Game Informer, Miyazaki gave a quote about poison swamps. "But when making the game, I rediscovered my love for making poison swamps. I know how people feel about them, but you know. Suddenly I realize I'm in the middle of making one, and I just can't help myself. It just happens." I'm not showing this quote to bash Matthew for something he couldn't possibly have known at the time. Rather, I want to show it as an example of Matthew just cynically assuming the worst from these games and their creators. This mindset of his will become even more apparent with points he will make later on in this video, so I'll address it further when he makes them.
As bad as that is, there's few things worse than when the designers botch traps and ambushes. One of the most disappointing examples is the giant archer in the Undead Settlement. You can see this situation coming a mile away, so when you finally arrive at the field of giant arrows, it's obvious you need to think about your approach first. For a brief moment, this mimics the best of Demon Souls. You're there, as an adventurer, trying to decide how to overcome a difficult situation. You even have as much time to think about it as you like. The most reasonable line of thought is that the arrow will have a certain amount of travel time, so if you change direction after you hear the shot, you'll be safe. Wrong. The arrow magically curves in mid-air because this is no longer a series where you outsmart your opponents, it's a series where you press the roll button at the right time.
As a preface, despite the fact that I'm about to defend this trap, I do not think that it is flawless. As a matter of fact, I actually agree with Matthew and think that the insane tracking of the giant's arrow is a problem that derails the entire trap. There are options other than dodging at the right time, however. For starters, you could begin the game with a young white branch, and be rewarded for choosing one of the weaker starting gifts by having the giant be friendly towards you from the outset. Second, you can avoid going through this trap until you have met the giant and made peace with him, or avoid it entirely if you have no desire to fight the curse-rotted Greatwood. You can also block the arrows easily with a mid-shield, which Matthew actually has on his character in this footage, but for some reason does not use. This is literally all you need to do to make this trap not about rolling at the right time, and yet he does not do it. Lastly, you can use Hidden Body, which prevents the giant from shooting at you, which actually seems like a textbook example of outsmarting your opponent. So even what I agree has to be one of the worst traps in Dark Souls 3 has several ways to go about solving it that don't even involve rolling. So the assertion that this series is about rolling at the right time is as wrong as it is incendiary. And Matthew made this argument by selecting one singular trap from one singular game, and not making any effort to make the best of this flawed trap by finding a smart way around it. Perhaps a botched trap or two is to be expected when a game is trying to throw you into a large variety of dangerous and cerebral situations. If Matthew is okay with some of the bosses in Demon's Souls being flawed, even though it's such a focused game, then maybe he should not judge Dark Souls 3 or any other games in the series for having a few traps that miss the mark. Because these games have plenty of traps that do measure up to the standards of Demon's Souls. I would like to define a trap as being a level hazard that the player must take notice of and adapt their playstyle around to overcome, and define an ambush as being an instance of one or more enemies lying in wait to attack an unsuspecting player. In Demon's Souls, we have the dragons that protect certain parts of Boletaria, and the player must anticipate their arrival by paying attention to background audio and time their traversal of these protected areas so they are not burned. Stacking up fire defensive equipment and pushing through the damage is another good way of going through this type of trap. The Shrine of Storms has the flying stingrays, which the player may see but not expect to be hostile. The player can dodge through or block their attacks, as well as sacrifice a ring slot and use the Thieves' Ring to become invisible to the stingrays. Every single game has some variation on fire barrels used by enemies to kill the player, and the trend started in Demon's Souls. In Dark Souls 1 there is the boulder that the Hollow rolls down the stairs in the Undead Asylum. Sen's Fortress is a funhouse of traps with pendulums that send you flying off of narrow walkways, which are usually paired up with a Serpent Man shooting lightning bolts at you. Dark Souls 1 also introduces mimics, which are indicated by their chain being different from standard chests, and are sometimes placed in odd parts of a room to make the player skeptical of them, like the mimic in Sen's Fortress. The Anno Londo archers are a level hazard that requires a lot of planning and execution in order to overcome, because the player must expose themselves to enemy fire, dispatch one or more of the archers, or find a way around them, and avoid being knocked off of the narrow walkways. There's also the skeleton hiding in the Tomb of the Giants, which will kick you off the ledge whenever you walk past him. In my footage, I shot a neural decoy in the general area, which gets him to reveal his position before ambushing me. In Dark Souls 2, there is a trap outside of the Shaded Woods where the player frees Rosabeth, pulls the lever and locks themselves in with a group of enemies and a basilisk. I was able to trigger this ambush before locking myself in, which was a neat little way of diffusing a lot of the danger with it, since I didn't have to deal with the basilisk and had the option of running away. There are NPCs in the Shaded Woods that the player may initially confuse for Grey Phantoms. You cannot lock onto them, and a way to make fighting them easier is to attack the trees with faces, which takes the attention of the enemies off the player. There are also the bells in the Undead Crypt, which summon enemies when they are hit. Players must avoid hitting these bells and not allow enemies to hit them either, as well as destroy the statues that the enemies are spawning from. They also booby-trap certain chests in a variety of different devious ways, my favourite of which being the chest that summons spiders to kill the player. The player can circumvent this trap by using a torch and scaring the spiders away. Dark Souls 2 also turns certain chests into mimics on New Game Plus. My favourite trap in the game is the painting of the Chandra that curses you, which the player can counter by wearing the Black Witch Veil. In Bloodborne we have the old man in a wheelchair in Yharnam, who shoots the player in the back when they go to pick up an item. This is a punishment for not being homicidal enough. There's also its sister trap in the DLC, where the player picks up an item off of a wheelchair and it starts a countdown to a detonation. If you see it coming, then you can run out of the range of the explosion. The Brain of Mensis frenzies players when they are caught out of cover. This is similar to when Dura tries to spray the player down with a machine gun. There is the Pit of Crows and the Cannon in the Forbidden Woods. The Winter Lanterns are very dangerous enemies, and taking large amounts of damage when fighting them is to be expected, so the player can instead use blue elixirs to sneak around them. In Dark Souls 3, there are mounds of snow with items on them that will break away whenever the player steps on them, sometimes leaving the player in dangerous areas. There are the angels that the player must sneak past, outrun, or use hidden body to casually walk past. There are the abyssal jars in the catacombs of Carthus, as well as the rolling balls of skeletons which the player can destroy if they can seek out the skeleton with the hat. There are also the arms that pop out of books in the Grand Archives, and the player can protect themselves from this trap by using the Curse Bite Ring, or a Purging Stone, as well as nullify it by dipping their head in the wax. These are just a couple of traps from each game that encourage the adventurer mindset, and almost all of them allow you to approach them in ways other than rolling at the right time. These games give you the autonomy to change your loadout or your tactics to suit whatever situation they throw you in, and using your tools in creative ways is one of the best ways to feel like an adventurer.
To be fair to the later games, it's important to point out that flashes of Demon Souls style brilliance do show through from time to time, and it's telling that they're often some of the most memorable moments in their respective games. Intentionally turning the Sif fight into an anticlimax is far more impactful than just letting it play out normally. This is especially funny to look back on now that the series seems obsessed with multi-phase bosses that get stronger after you smack them around a bit. The reality is, when you slash a big wolf creature enough times, it has trouble standing up. Rather than let you feel like a big man all the time, Dark Souls tried to remind you of the grim reality, and it worked.
Demon Souls style brilliance. Is everything positive about these games the product of Demon Souls, to the point where even their new ideas are inextricably linked to it? I think Demon Souls, in addition to being a high quality game, also laid the bedrock for the franchise. But I don't think that it lays claim to every good idea that these games have for the rest of time. The thing about these anti-climax bosses is that they are a subversion of traditional gameplay tropes, and the only way to ensure that they are as impactful as possible is to ration them out. Dark Souls 1 has Gwyn and Sif, who are both very pitiable. Dark Souls 2 has the Last Giant, who seems like a generic boss fight at first, but is later revealed to hold a burning grudge against the player character after their encounter in the Memory of Jay, which recontextualizes your first fight against him. You also have Vendrick, who is spoken of highly by many of the characters in the game, and the Emerald Herald explicitly sets you up as his replacement, and when you meet him, he is a husk of a man who doesn't even seem to notice you until you attack him first. Bloodborne has Lawrence, whose legs are severed on his last phase, which leaves him like a cornered, wounded beast flailing around trying to survive. Dark Souls 3 has the Stray Demon, whose lower body also collapses when attacked enough, and the Old Demon King enters a weakened state like Sif when he's nearing death. It's not like Fromsoft doesn't understand what happens when you hurt a wolf. They just know that trying to make the player feel guilty after every boss fight is a fool's errand.
I assume that most people enjoy Sif anyway because you get a pretty normal fight at the start, so how about I give you a genuinely unpopular opinion? My favourite boss in Bloodborne isn't Garmin or Ludwig or the Orphan, it's this mad bastard. Mikolash feels like a boss for people who enjoy Demon Souls because he does something a boss isn't supposed to. He runs away. Trying to catch him while he flees and rambles like a nutcase is unlike anything else in the entire series. This is made all the better by the way Bloodborne firmly establishes itself as a grim game. The Nightmare of Mentis is an imposing place, but at the same time there's something vaguely comedic about Mikolash's cowardly behaviour. It's not done just for the sake of it though. If anything, it would be disappointing if such a Lovecraftian game didn't have a fight against a mad scholar. It comes together well, and again, it's something I can't quite get elsewhere, which isn't to say that it's good just because it's different, but that certainly helps.
I find Matthew's appraisal of Mikolash's qualities as a boss to be agreeable. He is quirky, the mechanics of the boss fight are as fleshed out as they need to be, and he exudes personality. Two things though. Why is Mikolash a boss for people who like Demon Souls? I like Demon Souls, and while I think Mikolash is a good boss, I don't enjoy fighting him. Quirky bosses are not just a Demon Souls thing. Every single Fromsoft game has them. Which leads me to my second problem. Mikolash is unique, but he is not unlike anything else in the series, because he shares the concept of running away with Gwendolyn, with his own set of changes and refinements. If I wanted to invoke MatthewMatosis style criticism, I could say that Mikolash is a Gwendolyn-esque experience. I hope that when I frame it like this, you can see how strange and fallacious it is for somebody to boil down a boss fight to its most basic component, and then say that it's a derivative of something else. I'm also shocked that Matthew did not mention Phalanx, a boss who runs away from you after you've killed their hoplites. Just because he has nowhere to go doesn't mean it's not a core component of the fight. Additionally, if we are operating by Matthew's own logic, then I could also bring up the Hermes boss fight from God of War 3, and say that if I wanted a Mikolash-esque experience, why would I not just play God of War 3? A game with more combos, therefore better combat. Also, the part where MatthewMatosis says it's not good because it's different really rubs me the wrong way. Because earlier in this very video, he praises the less defendable and even flawed systems of Demon Souls by saying that they are good because they are different from everything else. Obviously, he does not have to be an absolutist on this subject, but it is just jarring to see someone's logic just contradict itself like this in such a short amount of time.
In a 2009 interview about Demon's Souls, Miyazaki himself said, "When designing the bosses, I made sure that they would be varied and exciting. I prepared different gameplay and strategies for each one so that players didn't get tired of the same fight every time. We wanted to surprise players and encourage them to figure out different tactics, to think on their feet." It's been the better part of a decade since that interview, so it's fully possible that Miyazaki has changed his mind since then, but it's still a quote that resonates with me at least.
My research into the bosses of this series point me towards the conclusion that Miyazaki did not change his mind on this matter. He and his team still enjoy making bosses that are quirky and have hidden mechanics or some sort of strategy that the player can employ in order to obtain an advantage.
If the Dancer of the Boreal Valley had been in Demon's Souls, I probably would have loved it. It has an intriguing visual design and the unconventional attack animations present a good challenge. The reason I don't enjoy it is because it's in a game filled with bosses just like it. Fromsoft have long since figured out that one way they can punish players who carelessly roll around all the time is to hold the anticipation phase of attack animations for about half a second longer than you'd expect. They've completely abused this trick to the point where most bosses seem to have at least a few of those attacks, and even many basic enemies do as well. This could be a whole topic by itself, but rather than dwell on it, let's just focus on the fact that by the time you reach the Dancer, you've already had to adapt to a huge number of unconventional timings designed solely to catch you out. The thought of learning even more weird attack animations so I can roll and stab my way to victory yet again just isn't all that appealing anymore. I could point to many of the bosses in Dark Souls 3 and say that they're pretty good, but only in isolation. A great game is more than the sum of its parts.
The Dancer has a rhythm to her moveset that is unique to herself. There is no boss in Dark Souls 3 that is just like her. Even if we were to grant that the Dancer is another boss that you have to learn the pattern of and execute perfectly, it would still be a different pattern from the other bosses in the game. Of course, I do not grant this point, because I can just use a shield to block her attacks, or use the geometry of the arena to avoid them, or stay at range and use spells. Which is exactly what you should do if the idea of rolling and stabbing is not appealing to you. Use a shield, use magic, use items, use co-op, or maybe just stop playing games that do not appeal to you. These games are too good to be bogged down by this sort of ridiculous criticism that does not judge the games for what they are, but instead for how good they are at making you feel like you're playing Demon's Souls. They're all good bosses for the game that they're in. They have more action in them than the boss fights in Demon's Souls, but it's not to the detriment of the game, because Dark Souls 3 increased the amount of action mechanics and RPG mechanics for the player to utilize.
A little restraint would go a long way, as has been proven in a few other instances. Most of us can probably agree that the reveal of Irithyll in Dark Souls 3 is one of its better moments. You emerge from the catacombs and see a beautiful, snow-covered landscape topped by a crescent moon. It's a wonderful vista. One thing Miyazaki and I seem to have in common is a fondness for these kinds of snow areas. As much as I love them, and believe me I do love them, I can still see that if the game had been nothing but snowy nighttime levels up to that point, the Irithyll reveal would have meant nothing. Just because it's my favourite kind of area doesn't mean I want the whole game to be like that. It's the surprise that makes it work. Another example would be Gwyn's theme in Dark Souls 1. You ask anyone who played Dark Souls and they'll list it as one of the most memorable tunes, but would it have been as good if the entire soundtrack was somber piano music? Of course not. It's the contrast with previous boss themes that makes it stand out. My point here is that even traditional boss fights stand to benefit by including others that don't fit into the same mold. When it's a foregone conclusion that every fight will be a dodge and punish affair, they lose their impact. Call it whatever you want. Restraint, pacing, surprise, variety, contrast. It's something Demon's Souls has in spades which the later games lack.
What Matthew is talking about is variety, and he says that having variety is good. I agree. What I can't agree with is him claiming that the later games lack variety in their boss fights. For starters, I'm still not sure what Matthew means when he says a boss fight is traditional, because he does not define his terms, and he uses his terminology very loosely. I'm going to assume that a traditional boss is one focused on combat. Granting the point that this traditional dodge and punish type boss is almost exclusively what Fromsoft is doing with their recently released games, which they aren't because there are plenty of bosses with their own quirks and strategies, it still does not mean that they lose their impact. Many games like Devil May Cry, Nioh, and God of War focus almost entirely on traditional bosses and keep things impactful by consistently ramping up the tension and difficulty. And the fact of the matter is that FromSoft games Have deep enough combat, and give the player enough choices for character development and how they want to approach situations, that they can sustain their style of consistently escalating boss fights. But they also make sure to inject strategies and quirks to as many bosses as they can, to make sure that there's a reason to use those options that they provide you. The bosses themselves also add variety of their own just by existing, since they usually act as a highlight after the player has finished exploring a level. So not only do they add variety to the gameplay loop, they also have variety amongst themselves as a set, as I have already demonstrated.
Catering to a larger audience has simply sucked more and more soul out of the series. Players whine about gimmick boss fights, so bosses become basic combat encounters and nothing more. Players want honourable PvP so they can test their skills against each other in a shallow, laggy, min-maxing backstab magic spam fest instead of having fun with the things you can uniquely do in these games, like disguise yourself as an environmental doodad before kicking an unsuspecting player off a cliff. Never underestimate a community's ability to take a cool feature and use it for the most boring thing imaginable.
This is my least favourite part of this video, because it is where Matthew veers the hardest into his judgmental rantings. For starters, bosses have not become basic combat encounters. Thanks for playing, try again. I have already demonstrated why this argument does not hold any water. Matthew's point about PvP is simply toxic, and it is a distilled example of what this entire video is doing, which is casting shame on others for having different preferences and dismissing their experiences. People who engage in these fair duels do so because they have fun, and the people who like to employ cheeky tactics when they invade are not harmed by it, because Fromsoft has continued to cater to both groups in these games, and expand their options with new releases. He is devaluing the experience of making a character, determining their build, and setting them up against other players, making reads and using our brains to defeat an opponent on roughly equal footing. This is something that you can uniquely do in the Souls games if you want this experience with this type of combat, and Matthew dismisses this unique experience because it's something he doesn't like. I also can't help but feel he is selling the trickery-based approach to invasions short by only mentioning this extremely basic and predictable strategy. What about turning a group of dead enemies into a minefield with dead again? What about using a great bow to send a host off of a cliff without ever being seen? What about using rapport, or a seed of a giant tree to weed out a camping invader? If the rest of Matthew's video does not prove that his view of the series is narrow to a fault, then hopefully a point as egregious as this one does. Matthew also says that the problems discussed thus far into the video and beyond are the result of expanding audience sizes for these games. He does not theorize, he says it outright, as if it's a fact. From what I gather from Miyazaki's own words in interviews nearing the release of Elden Ring, it is absolutely not the case, and Matthew does not provide a shred of evidence to back it up. People cry their eyes out, begging for an easy mode with the release of every new Souls game, and Fromsoft refuses to capitulate every single time. People also wrongly counter the lack of an interconnected world against every game that is in Dark Souls 1, even though they are not trying to be interconnected, and should not be judged as such. And despite this ritualistic outcry, From Software continues to make the games the way they want to make games. Let's not forget about Miyazaki's fondness for poison swamps, despite what people think about them. These are examples of why I believe that FromSoft's primary objective is to stay true to their own vision, regardless of what audiences want, because they know that their vision appeals to a large group of people. I doubt that they would ever spurn their audience by purposefully making a game that people would hate, but they aren't going to bend over backwards to please people either. It seems like, at most, FromSoft will listen to audience demand only if it falls in line with what they're making. For example, the password system in Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3 is something they added because they knew people wanted to play these games with their friends, and their systems in previous games made that more difficult than it needed to be. In an interview between Miyazaki and Edge magazine, released in December of 2021, he was asked, "The open-world action RPG genre features some of the most notable games of recent years, including Breath of the Wild, The Witcher 3, and Skyrim. Stepping into that design space with Elden Ring, where did you feel there was the most opportunity to leave your own mark on the genre?" Miyazaki responded by saying, "I don't want to put it in such grand terms as, this is the mark I wanted to make on the industry. Rather, if I was in the mood to play a game, or if I had an ideal game world, Elden Ring gets pretty close to that. I create the games that are my type. Tight combat, fantasy medieval setting, with dungeons to explore and things like that. It's just what I'm into. And so, Elden Ring is really hitting all the right notes there. Now obviously Miyazaki said all of this several years after Matthew made his video, but I think it is relevant because it shows that Miyazaki and his team have always been making games that align with this idea of an ideal game. While this, without a doubt, flies in the face of Matthew's assertion of Fromsoft caving in, I can't help but wonder why Matthew would make this claim in the first place, when it genuinely seems like there is no reason to say something like this.
Players want convenience so they can fast travel and respec their stats, removing absolutely any and all tension wherever possible, just like every other RPG from the past 10 years.
I think it's clear to see that FromSoft now views fast travel as a feature that should be included in the player's base kit for exploration. Likely because the world design of Bloodborne, Dark Souls 2 and Dark Souls 3 is not interconnected, and not being able to fast travel would achieve nothing except for wasting the player's time. And the thing is, players do have a limited amount of time that they can spend with a game, and senselessly wasting it is a good way to ensure that they severely limit how much time they're willing to invest. Respec does not exist in these games, so you can change your character willy-nilly. The amount of times you can respec is hard-capped in Dark Souls 3, and it is limited, albeit less so, in Dark Souls 2, as there are ways to farm for soul vessels using bonfire aesthetics. The purpose of respecing is to save characters that do not have the capacity to tackle late game areas, because the player did not have enough information to allocate that point in a viable manner. It also exists so players can tackle the problems that the game offers them in a more fluid way, and only serves to greatly expand the sandbox of options players have available to them, before actually entering a combat scenario. Even if it is like every other RPG from the past 10 years, respecing serves a purpose that assists struggling players in a balanced way. Without respec, your options are giving up on your doomed character and starting the game over, and using your newfound knowledge to allocate your points more wisely, or not being able to experiment with more of the game's options because you are locked into a specific build. Either way, you are potentially wasting dozens of hours. Depriving the player of fast travel in a world that's not built for exclusively on-foot traversal would just be a liability. Maybe Matthew could advocate for a return for interconnected world design, but isn't that an addition from Dark Souls 1? Demon's Souls had fast travel, so does this not count as a disparaging comment on how Demon's Souls is like every other RPG from the past 10 years? I would think something like this would conflict with the thesis of the video, honestly. If the game is built for it, then the lack of fast travel would not be a monumental waste of time. But these games are not doing that, and are not lesser for it. Personally, I would argue that not having fast travel is not the objective way of doing things, like Matthew says. There are times when it can be used to great effect, like going through an older area with your new gear to get somewhere else and seeing just how much more damage your character can dish out. But it can also add a lot more mundanity, where a player can find themselves going on lengthy tracks back and forth between areas they have already explored, filled with enemies too weak to be anything more than a nuisance, even when utilizing the designed shortcuts for each area.
At some point, you just start to wonder what's next on the chopping block. Maybe the next game will have a built-in function to back up your save files, so you don't have to think too hard about any of those pesky decisions. If current trends keep up, sooner or later all we'll be left with is a generic blob of a game, enjoyed by everyone and loved by no one.
Interestingly enough, Matthew's prediction, as well as his predictions later in the video, did not actually transpire. This is unsurprising because his predictions are based on misplaced malice and condescension instead of anything concrete. Also, just because Matthew does not love a game, does not mean that it is incapable of being loved. People loved, continue to love, and will love these games as they are released in the future because their perception of these games is not based on how close they are to Matthew's preferences.
Of course, the players don't actually make the games. You can't blame the audience for the decisions made by the developers, but it's a stark difference going from assumed failure to subcultural phenomenon. Bloodborne was the game Sony banked on to push the PS4 into the hands of early adopters. That kind of financial pressure is a breeding ground for design by committee homogenization.
This assertion of homogenization is something that we have already covered earlier, when we discussed how FromSoft does not really cave in to audience demands. If anything, it seems like FromSoft's situation was a breeding ground for Miyazaki to have more autonomy over how these games are created, seeing as how he became president of From Software in 2014. If you take into account his Edge magazine interview, he has used his position of power to make his ideal game, not the game the publishers want him to make. Maybe it is just that publishers want him to make his ideal game, because they know that audiences will put up money to play it.
As if this wasn't frustrating enough, the real twist of the knife is that even though the series has started to stagnate, it hasn't even managed to carry many refinements from one entry to another. Problems are regularly solved in one game only to be undone in the next one. Demon's Souls remains the most non-linear entry in the series and still has by far the most believable environments. Dark Souls abandoned the health reduction penalty, which removed the incentive to open yourself up to invasion if you weren't going to summon. As bad as that was, at least it got the hollowing mechanic right by only allowing players to go human at the bonfire. In later games, players can wait until they're at the boss fog before opening themselves up to the online, making many invasions pointless. The interconnected world of Dark Souls 1 is still unmatched, with Dark Souls 3 being more or less a linear progression from one end of the game to the other. Yharnam is arguably the best, most intricate level design Fromsoft have ever done, but it's squandered by the inclusion of fast travel from the start, same as both Dark Souls sequels. The resource management challenge of the Estus system was completely destroyed by Dark Souls 2, and while Bloodborne's Blood Vial setup is at least thematically appropriate, it's still mechanically inferior. New Game Plus is still bare bones, even though Dark Souls 2 showed that remixed enemy placements could provide a fresh experience. Bloodborne used charge attacks to fix backstabs without resorting to excessive enemy tracking, but then Dark Souls 3 abandoned the idea. Ashen Estus is my favourite addition in Dark Souls 3, but at this point I fully expect it to be inexplicably dropped. Next time around we'll probably be back to a weird Blood Vial setup or something equally disappointing.
Matthew's statement about the series starting to stagnate is blatantly false. He has spent all this time trying to prove it, and the only thing he has said thus far that contributes to his assertion that this series is in a state of stagnation is his argument about the believability of the worlds, because Dark Souls 1, 2 and 3 have some nonsensical doors and elevators. Although I'm not sure how that directly points to stagnation, or how this could be classified as by far less believable than Demon's Souls. Matthew's statement on the game solving problems and undoing their own progression is false, at least for the examples that he brings up, because he views Fromsoft changing an aspect of their game design for a new entry as a form of regression. Things do not change exclusively to solve a problem. For example, the Estus system was not reused for Bloodborne for one reason or another, likely because From Software did not think it suited the needs of the gameplay. In a game with frantic combat where health is rapidly taken away and taken back by the player through the rally system, the careful resource management based Estus system may not have seemed like the right fit. And so they made a system where heals are more dynamic, a system where the player expends healing items and can get more back by killing enemies and looting their blood vials. If anything, the blood vial and rally mechanics are iterations and expansions on the concept of regaining health through aggression, which was explored in Dark Souls 1 with the Ring of the Evil Eye. Also, FromSoft iterating upon and changing their systems does not mean that they are discarding solutions. They could just be experimenting with different ways to solve a problem. Their game development process is not a linear progression towards betterment, and it seems like, for some gameplay mechanics, they want to explore some of the different ways in which to iterate upon what was done in their previous games. As for Demon's Souls being the most non-linear game in the series, I suppose so? Demon's Souls was developed without the need of a cohesive world map, and instead had a stage select menu. I assume this made it much easier to be non-linear. However, I fail to see how non-linearity is a solution to a problem, or how linearity is a problem to be solved. For example, Dark Souls 3 has a large, cohesive map with seamless transitions between different levels, with a few exceptions like Archdragon Peak, the DLC, and Firelink Shrine. And while this may have come at the cost of having more linearity, their addition makes up for it, and the game is still able to maintain a high level of non-linearity despite the trade-off. Dark Souls 2 and 3 both reprise the health reduction for being hollow, but all of these games are different from Demon's Souls, so them straying from the path of Demon's Souls is not something they should be criticized for. Also, people do not exclusively summon outside of boss fogs. Many people summon because they need help, with both the level and the boss fight, which means that there would be plenty of opportunities for them to be invaded. In Dark Souls 3, the player has their max HP reduced, and may want to become embered while exploring the level just for that HP boost, which could also open them up for invasions. In Bloodborne, the player is open to invasions after they summon until they kill the boss or kill the Chime Maiden, which means that they could be left open to invasions for a potentially long time. All of these games have ways of incentivizing you and punishing you for using the online features. One game being different from the other does not make it inferior. The interconnected world of Dark Souls 1 would be unmatched if From Software had attempted to match it and failed. In reality, FromSoft's world design has changed. possibly because of a change in philosophy whenever it comes to world design. With Dark Souls 2, Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3, the design has shifted towards simply having areas being connected with each other. Also, this description of Dark Souls 3 being a linear jaunt from one end of the game to the other is disconnected from the truth. Dark Souls 3 has multiple points of divergence where players can feel free to tackle levels and bosses in whatever order they desire. The player can kill the dancer before the curse-rotted Greatwood, which can allow them to explore 2 late-game areas, access late-game items, and get a +9 weapon before they've even reached a fourth of their way through the game, so long as they're skilled enough to surpass the obstacles placed before them at such a low level. To clarify, whenever I say skill, I don't mean rolling through every attack. Shields are a viable option for every single boss in Dark Souls 3. You can also further Yuria's questline and get the Dark Hand to help ease the difficulty as well. There are other points of divergence, such as the Crucifixion Woods and the Catacombs of Carthus. Ashes of Ariandel is also available for players to explore as soon as they've reached the Cathedral of the Deep, and the player can go to the Ringed City before the kiln of the First Flame, if they're able to kill Sister Frida, where they can acquire +3 rings early if they so choose. The player is given a checklist of tasks they must complete in order to beat the game, but the way in which they do it is left up to them. Also, how is the level design in Bloodborne being squandered because of fast travel? You can fast travel to different predetermined points in the game world, sure, but it's not like you can circumvent the gameplay by fast traveling directly to the boss room if you do not feel like exploring. There is a lantern in the middle of Central Yharnam, a lantern in Yosefka's clinic, and a lantern in the Cleric Beast's boss arena. If you want to get to the Cathedral Ward and you do not have the lantern there activated, you still have to engage with the complex level design by navigating through Central Yharnam and to Cathedral Ward from one of these lanterns. The availability of fast travel does not squander the complexity of Central Yharnam, or any other area for that matter. I've already explained how, and have given my theory as to why the Estus system was changed for Bloodborne, but as for Dark Souls 2 and 3, I think they had different reasons for their changes. For Dark Souls 2, it is clear that they wanted players to hybridize their use of life gems and the Estus Flask, and both were given their fair share of benefits and drawbacks as a result. The player can no longer kindle bonfires for upwards of 20 Estus uses, and the Estus Flask must instead be upgraded using items that the player must seek out around the world as they progress through the game. Life gems have slow healing animations, and the weakest and most common form of life gem restores a small amount of health at a slow pace, in order to compensate for their availability. I think that this system is actually a little bit more balanced than the healing system in Dark Souls 1, because the Rite of Kindling was pretty broken, as 15 to 20 heals is a little too much, especially when you factor in humanities, which can be farmed, and are just commonly dropped by enemies, and heal the player completely. Dark Souls 3 did away with life gems, but kept the system of upgrading your Estus Flask, and added the mechanic of players needing to allot their Estus for healing and restoring FP. Dark Souls 2's use of New Game Plus is a boon for Dark Souls 2. It's an extra feature of that game, and not really something that later games have deprived players of. However, Dark Souls 3 still keeps the aspect of finding upgraded rings in New Game Plus, which shows that they had some interest in keeping this mechanic from Dark Souls 2. The Ringed City somewhat diminished the effect, however, by adding +3 variations of rings that are available in standard New Game, although certain rings like the Sage Ring +2 are only available in later New Game Plus cycles. Abandoned is a very loaded word for FromSoftware's treatment of backstabs. In truth, we have no idea why they changed backstabs, but I think that it's more likely that FromSoft deemed Bloodborne's system of backstabs ill-suited for a game with the style of combat and pacing that Dark Souls 3 had. Also, even if we were to grant Matthew the point that tracking is excessive in these games, and that it's somehow a bad thing, enemies in Dark Souls 3 do have other ways of preventing you from backstabbing. Like how Lothric Knights will hit you with their shields if you try to strafe behind them. Sister Frida and the Abyss Watchers can also dodge out of the way, just to name a couple of examples. Sekiro actually maintains the system of Estus upgrading introduced in Dark Souls 2, although there is no Ashen Estus equivalent because it would have been unnecessary. It did this while adding its own mechanics like healing pellets and regaining health from death blows. Even these systems could be seen as iterations on systems in previous games, like the Ring of the Evil Eye, Blood Vials, the Rally mechanic, Life Gems, and random Estus drops, because they tie regaining health to aggression, as well as having extra healing items that work very slowly. Elden Ring seems to take after Dark Souls 3, with the Flask of Crimson Tears for your health and Flask of Cerulean Tears for your FP. So no, they did not change the system. likely because they do not think it requires changing as of yet. This prediction from MatthewMatosis comes from a place of jaded contempt for this series, as it is based on what would be the most negative thing for From Software to do in his eyes, rather than being based off of anything factual.
Keep in mind, these are just the problems FromSoft actually bothered to address at some point. There's a whole host of issues that have never even been looked at. The camera is still atrocious when unlocked during combat because it does nothing and occupies the thumb you use to press the roll button. Lock-on still breaks during boss fights even though there's nobody else in the room, and the button still snaps the camera behind the player when it's not in range, with no option to disable it. I've played hundreds of hours of these games and I've never once actually wanted to use the button for that. Weapons still bounce off walls even though enemies glide right through, giving them an unfair advantage. Critical attacks still don't work properly on slopes. Input buffering is still overzealous and sometimes feels inconsistent, a minor annoyance in the early games but completely unacceptable for something the speed of Bloodborne or Dark Souls 3. Enemy pathfinding is still embarrassingly wonky, leading to exploitable or unpredictable movement patterns, and enemies can still be leashed, defeating the purpose of the entire combat system.
This assertion about the camera is nonsensical. The camera is a tool for the player to use at their own discretion during gameplay. Advocating for the camera to have a mind of its own and decide for the player what it's going to focus on is as foolish as advocating for the game to decide when to heal and attack for the player. Bosses breaking lock-on is not a glitch or an oversight of any kind. It is a strategy the game employs in order to disorient the player and impede their ability to respond to incoming attacks. And as the player, you respond by regaining line of sight on the enemy. The same way you have to choose the best times to heal and attack, you also must choose how you want to use your camera effectively. The camera snapping behind the player whenever they try to lock on is an actual issue, and FromSoft have since alleviated the effects of this problem in Sekiro by making Wolf's lock-on range much longer than any of the previous games, severely cutting down on instances of this happening. This is also true in Elden Ring, as we can see from this footage from the Game Informer coverage of it. FromSoft have clearly taken steps to address this problem. Also, even though you have found no use for this function, I would hesitate to say it serves no purpose, seeing as how you fail to find a use for a basic shield, calling blocking ill-advised when it certainly is not. That being said, I think more accessibility options are better, and would appreciate the option to turn this function off. One demographic that does use this function is speedrunners who like to play these games blindfolded. It's a niche demographic for sure, but it's also a very niche input, and removing it outright instead of giving players the option to turn it off would make this type of run much more difficult, for no good reason. The point about enemy strikes gliding through walls is true for everything except for NPCs that use the player's skeleton. Be that as it may, extending this mechanic of attacks bouncing off of walls to common enemies would just make the process of designing and placing enemies more nightmarish for the developers at FromSoft, as it would require the introduction of several new variables when developing AI. Also, players could then probably find a way to exploit it. It seems like a large amount of resources dedicated to solving something that is not really that important. Is it an unfair advantage? Yeah, maybe, but maybe it's there to balance out the advantages the player has, like healing and summoning phantoms. The game is also very consistent with this rule for enemies. If the game were more unpredictable with this mechanic, then this problem would be much more pressing. But it's not. Critical attacks worked on slopes as early as Dark Souls 2. I'm sure that it's not 100% functional, because slopes make things more complicated, but it is consistent enough to be a reliable strategy in that game, in Dark Souls 3 and Sekiro 2. Input buffering is a legitimate problem in the way these games control, and it was unacceptable as early as Demon's Souls. My only guess is that input buffering is a problem that was too complicated for FromSoft to fix at the time, rather than a flaw that they lazily allowed to persist throughout the franchise. It's possible that the severity of input buffering is a conscious decision on their part, but if that's the case, I'd say it's a fairly baffling choice. That being said though, Sekiro has either gotten rid of input buffering, or reined it in to the point of it being negligible, because inputs are buffered extremely late into animations. Sekiro came out in 2019, so Matthew is not wrong when he talks about input buffering, but I want to bring it up because it works as an example of how his negative outlook on From Software is unwarranted. The enemy AI in these games is pretty unimpressive overall, and it's mostly saved by masterful enemy placement. Once again, this point does hold water. This is improved upon in Sekiro since enemies are much better at following the player through large environments than they were in Dark Souls, and enemies in Elden Ring seem to be capable of such feats as well. Enemies being leashed is a problem with game design as a whole, not just with FromSoft games. I won't claim to know exactly why that is, but I know for a fact that Dark Souls and Bloodborne are far from the only games where enemies have trouble following players from one place to another, so there's no reason to single out the Souls games in this regard.
If these games are going to be iterative sequels, at the very least they could be good at that, but they're not. 5 installments is more than enough time to figure out what makes these games good and iron out the kinks. Many other series have come a lot further in fewer tries.
How are these games not good at iterating between installments? The reason I phrase it this way is because 2 of these 5 games are not even sequels to each other. Always wording it as though these games are all sequels to each other is incorrect and gives you a skewed view of the series. And the way Matthew talks about these games, it seems like anything FromSoft makes would just be another sequel to Demon's Souls. I think FromSoft has done a fairly good job at distilling the best elements of these games and expanding upon them with every new release, as well as ironing out the kinks. Every game sells more than the last, and every game has several sweeping improvements over the previous installments. Every game since Dark Souls 2 has made sure to make co-oping with your friends more practical while also maintaining the option to co-op with strangers. Every game has improvements to the user interface. The animations in FromSoft games have been steadily improving with a huge leap with the release of Bloodborne. I'm sure that there are games that have made greater strides in fewer steps, but I don't see why that even matters. That has no bearing on the quality of any of the Dark Souls games, Demon's Souls or Bloodborne, so I don't think that this statement acts like the biting criticism Matthew may have intended for it to be. It seems more like a random anecdote than anything. Different games are made by different development studios, consisting of different people and different amounts of people, and are published by different companies in different contexts, with different budgets and different timeframes. If we take video games as an art form as well as a product, every artist or group of artists has their own journey in search of refining their craft, and they're not necessarily comparable to each other. What matters is that whatever they produce is of high quality, which FromSoft games definitely are.
With all that said, it's finally time to take a shortcut back to my point from the beginning. Demon's Souls is one of those rare, genuinely innovative games that did enough new things its influence can be clearly felt on the gaming landscape of subsequent years. That originality is one of its best qualities, but it would be unfair to expect every game FromSoft creates to be innovative.
Demon's Souls is the product of what came before it. It was far from the first dark fantasy RPG FromSoft had created, and Miyazaki, being the prolific borrower of ideas that he is, based Demon's Souls off of a bunch of books and games that he enjoyed, like Zelda, Dungeons & Dragons, Ico, Shadow of the Colossus, the Fighting Fantasy series of novels, and of course Berserk. This does not demean or degrade Demon's Souls. Every other game or piece of art in general is a product of the influences on the creator or creators. The problem is that Matthew does not judge Demon's Souls as the product of the things that came before it, yet harshly judges and demeans every other FromSoft game, classifying them as Demon's Souls derivatives that will forever live in the shadow of the original. I'm inclined to agree with Matthew when he says it is unfair to criticize FromSoft's other games for not being innovative. But if he believes this, then why did he present a lack of innovation as a caveat to Dark Souls 1 being a good sequel earlier in the video? It seems a little underhanded to criticize Dark Souls 1 in a way that he knows is unfair, without first explaining that it is unfair criticism. He also heaps praise upon Demon's Souls for what it does that he sees as being innovative, but when the later games carry over the same innovations, he says that they mindlessly copy Demon's Souls. And when they add their own innovations, he refuses to acknowledge them, calling them refinements instead. This is important because Matthew calling things refinements rather than innovations is his way of saying that the additions of games after Demon's Souls are lesser. And if his word choice is incorrect, then in this instance, his argument is incorrect.
The more important thing about Demon's Souls is how cohesive it is. It's FromSoft unfiltered, free to pursue an overarching design methodology even if that results in some unpopular decisions. That's what I want for every game developer. Games are more interesting when they're unshackled by the expectations of a narrow-minded fanbase or the financial whims of a publisher. Right now it feels as though these games have fallen victim to one or the other, maybe both.
I think that MatthewMatosis, a person who dismisses the appeal of countless aspects of these games because they are not what he likes, and someone who was too narrow-minded to incorporate something as simple as a shield into his gameplay, let alone more advanced things like spells such as Spook and Rapport, which weren't even mentioned once in his video, is the last person in the discourse around these games who should be calling anyone narrow-minded. I would say it's like the pot calling the kettle black. but it's more like the pot calling the silverware black. It's simple projection.
Whatever the cause, recreating the superficial elements of Demon's Souls isn't enough to make a truly great game by itself.
Case in point, Matthew has no ability to recognize any of Fromsoft's games other than Demon's Souls as their own individual experiences, and instead sees them as acts of mimicry that can only emulate Demon's Souls on a surface level.
It needs more. The magic of Demon's Souls lies under the surface. It's a culmination of ideas and concepts that work together in unity to accomplish something greater. That's not to say it's perfect. In fact, it seems pretty clear that it wasn't even finished before it was released, but the end result is a game that proves you can have it all. Haunting visuals, immersive environments, evocative sound design, satisfying gameplay, novel mechanics, intriguing storytelling, memorable characters, fun multiplayer, and a high level of replayability. They're not mutually exclusive goals. Games don't have to be one or the other. When you do it right, you can do it all. It may not be the best at any of those things, but what it offers instead is a complete package on a level that is arguably unmatched. Unfortunately, over time, Fromsoft decided to focus on some of those elements at the expense of others, and as a result, those games are more easily eclipsed by others which do those things better. Demon's Souls still stands tall because it knows what it is. A demonic soul with a heart of gold.
But if Demon's Souls isn't the best, why would I not just play a better game? Could it be because Demon's Souls is the only game with this specific mixture of all of these things? If that is so, then why on earth did Matthew feel the need to ask the same thing about Dark Souls and the rest of FromSoft's games? So yes, there are some aspects of these games that are eclipsed by their contemporaries, but they don't actually eclipse Dark Souls and Friends themselves. There will always be a reason to go back and play these games, and that's because they are good games, and because they are a concoction of all of these different things that create a very specific experience that no other game can supplant. Also, while listing off these things that make Demon's Souls great, Matthew also listed off a bunch of things that make Dark Souls and Bloodborne great. Why did Matthew not extend the same courtesy of not attacking their character using fallacies? I also think that it is hypocritical to say that a game does not need to make sacrifices in its content when Matthew openly displayed contempt for the game's catering to people who enjoy fair PvP, despite them catering to his preferred playstyle as well, and refining both at the same time. In one breath, he posits the virtues of artistic freedom, in the next he berates those with different tastes. He also says that FromSoft has, unfortunately, focused on certain elements to the expense of others. The problem is that he had 24 minutes to prove this and has not been able to. And if we are going to extol the virtues of creative freedom, is FromSoft not allowed to shift their focus from some aspects to others? Matthew presuming himself suited to tell From Software how to make their own games sounds much more narrow-minded than the fans that he himself calls narrow-minded. And him essentially calling FromSoft sellouts is nothing more than juvenile mudslinging. Is the exact same kind of thing a 12-year-old would say about their favorite YouTuber because they started doing something different. It may even be a little worse, because FromSoft had not even strayed far from Demon's Souls, and yet Matthew's still ready to attack them for selling out. Furthermore, I do not think that his final exaltation of Demon's Souls works, because it was achieved by bashing the other games and making them seem lesser in comparison. Instead of letting Demon's Souls stand on its own 2 feet, he would rather employ dishonest arguments in order to cut the other games down to a lower level. But clearly, it did have the power of resonating with people. Before dislikes were hidden, this video had a very positive like to dislike ratio, which means that this was a message that people were happy to hear and agree with. I can't help but think that it would be somewhat of a hollow victory though, since it was achieved exclusively through the use of sophistry. I am not sure if this video was created out of hatred for FromSoft's later games. Matthew seems to like the Dark Souls games, at least the first one, and Bloodborne as well, but at the same time he is willing to make generalization after generalization, and stretch them well beyond the absolute end of believability, and employ all manner of fallacious tactics such as doublethink, and being critical in a recklessly inconsistent manner, all in order to smear them to his audience. This is not really something a person with a genuine appreciation for a work of art even does. So, where do we find ourselves today? Elden Ring is right around the corner, and it's easily one of the most anticipated games of the last 2 years, and most FromSoft fans are as excited as they've ever been, but there's still a foul odour in the air. Among the excitement, there are still grumblings of discontent coming from people who do not want another rolling simulator. The problem here is that none of the Dark Souls games are rolling simulators. I have proven this beyond the shadow of a doubt, in a way that literally anyone who owns these games can try for themselves. And yet the misconception still persists, and I have no doubt that this video played a role in arming people who were simply burnt out on these games or just cynical towards them in the first place. After all, it distills this discontent and communicates it in a way that seems trustworthy enough to anyone who isn't ready to undertake the long and laborious process of systematically analyzing and debunking Matthew's cavalcade of horrendous arguments. In the end, I do hope that you might be more willing to play around with all these enjoyable and varied game mechanics that the developers at Fromsoft spent years of their lives crafting. And maybe, next time a person on the internet says something far-fetched, try doing some of your own fact-checking, and put their words to the test. Remember, the thing is, MatthewMatosis says the only option you have is to know is keep fucking press down for the right time. I'm still tanking the shit out of his attacks.
Yeah.
Look. Take that one back. Oh. Oh my god.
You beat him. Beat him by tanking.